Good evening and welcome to our program for Thursday evening, July 1st on helping women along the journey. Each of us, experience various challenges in our lives. Some of them we are able to handle on our own. In some cases, we turn to family or friends for help. We may pray for guidance, reach out to individuals or organizations who are designed to provide assistance. Sometimes these challenges are simply beyond our ability to manage. And for many women, experiences of domestic abuse transform their lives into circumstances too painful to withstand. For any number of reasons, women may turn to drugs or alcohol to help ease the pain. Some- Sometimes economic circumstances lead to damaged decision making. Any number of events may result in time in rehabilitation facilities or incarceration. Helping these women along their journey is a transformative experience for both people involved. This evening, we will hear from two Westminster members, Kitty Knox and Sue Weissinger, as they share the work that they have done to help other women along their journey. Kitty has been a volunteer with the Domestic Violence Center of Chester County, and Sue Weissinger has worked at the Baylor Correctional Center in Delaware. And so at this point, I'm going to turn the program over to Kitty, and she'll share much of her experiences. Sue will share hers, and then there'll be plenty of opportunity for questions or comments, either when Kitty is finished or when both have concluded their remarks. So welcome, Kitty and Sue.
Thank you. As Sue, can you put us all on screen share or something and start the slides?
I sure can.
Okay. The topic is helping women along the journey, and I'm talking about my experiences as a volunteer domestic violence support group facilitator. And then Sue's going to talk about her experience at Baylor's Women Correctional Institute. That's just, we're sharing the experience. Okay, so if you would go to the next one, please, I appreciate that. Several people have asked me how this started. I retired early. I was actually downsized, and I like to make sure everybody knows I retired early, because for the length of time that I've been doing this, if I had retired at a normal age, I would be about 110. But anyway, I was looking for something to do. Gary and I, when we retired, picked several things we wanted to do. We wanted to have fun, we wanted to learn, and we wanted to do something to give back in some way. And the church that we were attending at that time had a moment for mission every Sunday, and they talked about some organization, some nonprofit group that they were supporting. And at one point they talked about the Domestic Violence Center of Chester County, and it was before I had retired, and I just kind of filed that around and said that's something I might be interested in looking into when I'm not working. And so I did pursue it when I wasn't working, and talked over everything with them. And the first step in being a volunteer, there is a lot of training. You have to take 45 hours of general domestic violence training, and then if you're going to do anything special, you have to take more. And since I was going to do a support group, I had another 8 hours of training. And they now well, ever since then, they have required that all volunteers take 8 hours of update training every year. So that, you know, it's a very difficult situation, and you really need people to be up to date, and there's so much has gone on in the last 16 years since I've been involved with them in terms of gender changes and racial sensitivity, LGBTQ, and so on. The extra training that we have every year is really very valuable. So at the end of the training, they each of the staff members would come in and talk for a few minutes about what she did. And one of them that I thought was very interesting was that one woman, one of the counselors, went to a local alcohol and drug rehab facility once a week and facilitated a support group for women who had domestic violence issues. And I asked to go with her, and I went with her for 2 weeks. And then at the end of 2 weeks, unfortunately, she became ill, and they said, well, if you would like to do this group, go ahead and do it. And I ended up being the facilitator for 14 years. So sometimes, you know, I wasn't sure I was going to like it. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to do it, but it obviously was something that I found very fulfilling. Would you please go to the next slide, Sue? Sue Weissinger and I have talked a little bit about our two talks tonight. And one thing that we both feel is very important is that a lot of people really don't understand what domestic violence is. Many people think that it's just simply an incident where one person hits another person, and that's part of it, but that's not all of it. Domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over the other partner. It does not have to be physical. There are a lot of examples of domestic abuse that go on and on for years, and there's never anything physical about it. The types of abuse include physical, verbal, emotional, sexual, economic, where one person controls all the finances. You come home from work and turn over your paycheck and that's it. Psychological, those are all different types of abuse. So it's not just physical. There's all kinds of statistics out there, but the current one is that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will experience some form of domestic violence at some time in their lifetime, and that can be a one-time event. The numbers change a bit. It goes, if for repetitive, ongoing events, it's 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men will experience an ongoing domestic violence abuse at some time in their lifetime. It's all races, all ages, all sexual orientations, all religions, cultures, and genders that are involved in this. And for the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to just say that he did this to her, but that's not the way it works. It's in heterosexual relationships, it can be the woman abusing the man. It can be in lesbian relationships to women. It can be in gay relationships to men. So even though I will say for the purpose of convenience, he versus she, it can be anything and everything. And it's all socioeconomical backgrounds and education levels. Some people think that this is only a problem of the lower socioeconomic levels, but that's not true. Okay, next slide, please. These are some examples of what is domestic violence or domestic abuse. It's pushing, slapping, shoving, hitting, hair pulling, excessive tickling. That sounds silly, but if it's bothersome to you and they keep doing it, it's abusive. Threatening to hurt the victim, her children, or her family is a very popular method of abuse, because if you hurt something that is meaningful to someone else, it hurts her terribly. Putting her down at home or in public, calling her stupid, things like that. Causing fear by intimidation, destroying pets and property, again, that's the same. Destroying something that is valuable or meaningful to a person is a very abusive act. Abuse is very often force isolation from family, friends, or work because they're afraid that the other people are going to convince the woman that what is going on is wrong and try to convince her to leave. Controlling where the victim goes and what she does is very popular. Some of the women complained that when they went to the grocery store, they were given a certain time frame in which to go there and get back. And their abuser might check the speedometer, odometer on their car to see if they went anyplace else except for the grocery store. Forcing sex and unwanted sex acts is another abusive act, and using economic control, making the person turn over their paycheck and giving them a minimum amount of money. So these are all examples of domestic violence, domestic abuse. And the effects on the victim are really horrendous. Usually it starts with verbal abuse. Calling the person names, trying to do things to tear down their self-worth, their self-esteem. Then very often it will escalate to physical abuse. Not always, but very often. And there are certain triggers that will indicate that it is going to go from verbal to physical. In some cases, it's when the couple moves in together, because that gives the abuser more of a feeling of control. Getting married is another instance where it might go from verbal and emotional to physical. And one of the strangest ones I found was when the woman might have a child. Even if the man says he wants to have a child, when the child is born, that can be a real big trigger, because all of a sudden the abuser has lost control. He had control before, and now there's another person, a child, who is taking the woman's attention, taking her love, taking her care. So even though he may have wanted it, it's a trigger that sometimes will cause it to go from verbal and emotional to physical abuse. The woman, the abused woman, the victim, very often feels like she's walking on eggs. She has no idea of what's going to set him off. You may have seen some movies. There was a Julia Roberts movie, well, probably a long time ago, called Sleeping with the Enemy, where she just never knew what was going to set him off. It could be a physical situation with almost nothing causing it. The abuser supervises the behavior that the victim has. He has abuser and power. He has power and he controls everything. And he has very flexible standards. He can do what he wants. He can go out in the evening with his buddies, but she can't possibly go out with her girlfriends or her family or friends or anything like that. So the result is that in a lot of cases, the victim turns to drugs or alcohol to try to alleviate the physical or emotional pain that she's undergoing. And in some cases, the addiction to alcohol and drugs has been brought on by the abuser, because that's another way for him to control her. He may give her the drugs to try to talk her out of her supposed pain or the situation. And then once he gets her addicted, then he has more control over her. And because he can control the amount of drugs that she gets. So a lot of times, fortunately, thank God, she will end up in a rehab facility, which is good, but most of the rehab facilities do not have programs that specifically address domestic violence. There's a rehab facility here in Chester County that for many, many years, the Domestic Violence Center of Chester County has provided a weekly support group. It was originally done by a counselor who unfortunately had to leave because of health reasons. And I took it over, and it's a volunteer. It has been a volunteer group because I was a volunteer facilitator, and the women who attended were volunteers. They were not mandated to be in the group. We had to make it women only. There were some gay men in that facility who had abuse issues, but unfortunately we had to not allow them to come into the group, because if there were men in the group, even if they were gay men and even if they were victims, the women just would not talk. They, it wasn't going to happen. So we had to make it a women-only group. It could be either the victim or the abuser. There were many, many women in the group in the years that I facilitated it who said that they were the abuser. They sometimes it was because they were in a second relationship and they were so tired of the control that they had had in the first relationship that they were going to take control this time, and they were now the abuser. So we occasionally had both victims and abusers in the same group. There was no official curriculum, because normally a support group will have an official curriculum, but since this was a rehab facility, most of the women were there for the usual 28 days, and you really they were not necessarily in the group every single week, so you couldn't have a structured curriculum. So we had to kind of flow with it, and it was once a week between 60 and 90 minutes, but we had a certain amount of goals, even though we didn't have an official written curriculum to follow. Because we had a different group every week. We had some women who had been there once or twice, and some women who had never been there before. The first thing we did was to clarify what domestic violence, domestic abuse is, because there would be women who would come into the group and say, I don't really belong here. My relationship is okay, he has never hit me. And then about halfway through the group, they would say, oh, well, maybe my relationship is abusive after all, because they learned what we've just talked about, that there are a lot of ways other than physical violence where a woman is abused. The second one of my goals was to help them identify that they had choices, that they absolutely did not have to go back. The choices were difficult. They were going to not be easy, but that they had choices. They could go to a shelter. They could stay where they were and participate in support groups. They could get legal support. They could join a support group at a shelter. They could have counseling with a real counselor, not a volunteer. There were a lot of choices, and I wanted to make sure that they knew what all of these resources were, that no matter where they lived, they didn't all live in Chester County, but in every state and in essentially every county, there's some agency for domestic violence. There are housing options where they don't have to go back to wherever they were living before. There obviously are legal issues that they needed help with, particularly when there were children involved. There were all kinds of effects on children. Children of domestic violence is another issue that I could go on for a long time, but it being in a situation where the adults have an abusive and particularly violent relationship has all kinds of harmful effects on the children, and the children really need counseling. It'll show up in all kinds of ways, and I don't think we have enough time for that, so we'll keep going on. But one of the main goals of the support group was to improve the self-esteem of the women, because after all of this has gone on, they basically had no self-esteem at all. They thought they were totally worthless. They thought they deserved it. They were somehow convinced that they had asked for it. And one of my really strong goals was to try to improve their self-esteem. Okay. So what did we do, since we didn't have a structured methodology? I wanted to get them to talk. I always had a handout that I passed out at the beginning with something like maybe a true false quiz or some definitions or something like that. But the whole objective was to get them to talk. So sometimes it wouldn't take more than a few minutes to get somebody to talk and to have them talk about their experiences. And I, for some reason, had this twice, but many of the women had never told anybody about the abuse before. And when this happened, I wanted to stand up and shout, yay, but I couldn't, obviously. But one of the most important things was to get them to talk about it, to identify that it was real, to not keep it hidden, not keep it buried. And most of the time when they talked about it for the first time, they cried, but usually somebody else in the group had the same experience, and maybe they had shared and maybe they hadn't shared, but somebody would very often get up and put their hand on their shoulder or hug them, and it really was very helpful to I mean, it was just an unbelievable experience to get people to share things that they had never told anybody about before, that they had been carrying inside. And the longer they carried it inside, the more it was going to hurt their recovery from the addiction, the more it was going to delay their ability to move on to a more normal life. And so having them talk and cry and hug, and at the end of the group, every week, we always stood in a circle, holding arms around each other and recited the Serenity Prayer. And that's the way we finished the group. But during the group, we discussed the effect on victims, the effect on children, steps to recovery, how to move on and maybe have a relationship that was more traditional, more normal, that was more fulfilling. I used a variety of handouts, and I had a lot of brochures that the center had put together on legal assistance, counseling, and things like that. I always recommended counseling. Over the years, I read more than 25 books, and I had a list of all of the books that I would hand out to them and hope that some of them would read. Some were interested in books, some were not. And for a while we had a therapy dog, and that this was my first experience with a therapy dog. But she and her owner would come in, and she somehow knew who we were sitting in a circle, and she somehow knew who was really stressed, and she would just walk over and sit at this person's feet, and the person might pet her or something, and it was really beneficial to the group to have the dog there. So that was a new experience for me. Now, there was one big issue that we had to cope with, and it was an individual situation that we never had an answer for, and it was, are you going to forgive your abuser or not? Because to some women, they felt they had to forgive or they couldn't move on. And there were some women who said, I'm never going to forgive him. So if you want to go to the next slide, this is basically what it boils down to. I never knew how strong I was until I had to forgive someone who wasn't sorry and accept an apology I never received. We talked about that many, many times. And as I said before, it was really an individual thing. It was something that they all struggled with. And the only thing I could do was to pray with them and pray for them and hope that they found the answer that was going to work for them. Okay, last slide, I think. All right, what were the results? Feedback. Everything was limited by confidentiality. We didn't know anything other than first names. But what feedback I got from both the participants and the counselor was that it was good. Counselors would come up to me and say they wanted to make sure that somebody from their group attended the session, and that somebody had said that it was good. And I know that some of them did participate in activities at the center in Chester County, but I didn't know any details because being a volunteer, I'm not a counselor. really it was not appropriate for me to know anything more than hopefully they had followed up. And some of the women did come up to me at the end of the group and say that when they went on to wherever they were going to the next step, they were going to follow up, and they were rethinking their situation, and that they were hoping that they could do something different. So my experience, there's, I think you all know this, there's a lot of joy in helping someone who is troubled. And it was particularly wonderful when someone shared their experience for the first time. That was just so meaningful to me. I'll never forget it. It was often hard to hear about their experiences. There is definitely another world of people out there that I just, until the first week I went to this group, I just couldn't believe it. And it went, as it went on, I heard things that I just couldn't believe. And even if I could tell you about them, I wouldn't. I would sometimes come home and say to Gary, well, I heard something today that I didn't think I would ever hear. And I think I've heard everything now. And then 6 months later, I'd say, well, I heard something else that I just, you just can't believe what some of these women go through. So my conclusion is that I hope I helped some of them. When I finished the meeting, I would go out and sit in the car and pray for a few minutes and basically say, God, I can't do anymore. I have to turn this over to you. And I hope you can help them. And I still pray for them. And I would definitely do it again if I was given the opportunity. It was one of the most meaningful things that I've ever done, and a wonderful, wonderful 14 years. That's it. I'm done.
So
Questions for Kitty
we're
or
gonna do
comments?
me
for
and then do
Sue's?
questions? Yes,
I have a question. It's
okay, I
Sue?
want,
Sue? We're going to stop just for a second and see if there are questions or comments for Kitty, and then we'll go ahead.
fine.
Okay, great.
Sorry.
Marlis?
I always have difficulty understanding why it's so hard for women to leave an abusive relationship. Did you get an insight into that while you're working with the women, Kitty?
Yes, there's a whole list of reasons why it's hard. First of all, it's the most unsafe time for a woman when she leaves her abuser, because that's when he just really goes completely bonkers. There are a lot of reasons. It could be financial reasons. It could be that he's threatened to hurt her family, to hurt her children. If she happens to be in the country illegally, he has threatened to report her to whatever it is, the immigration department or something like that. They don't necessarily have any financial stability. They may not think they have any place to go. So what I tried to do was to get them to work with people at the center, because if they were going to leave, we always recommended that they do it with the advice of one of the people from the center who would guide them through it step by step. The average amount of time that it takes for a woman to leave her abuser is 7 efforts, because of all of the things involved. And hopefully she's got a counselor helping her get all of the things that she needs, like the children's birth certificates, the school records, any medical records. It's a real can of worms, and a very difficult time. And as I said, it's the most dangerous time in the life of a woman who's been abused.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll have more time for questions and comments. Sue Weissinger, would you like to proceed?
Sure. I want to pick up on what Kitty just said before I talk about Baylor. And that is that it absolutely is the most dangerous time for a woman when she leaves. The reason being that the secret's out. Domestic violence is one of those things that's a secret. And the abuser wants to keep it a secret. And lots of the times, the things he escalates and keeps doing is because he's afraid or she is afraid that the secret will get out. Well, once the person who's been abused leaves, the secret is out. And he is desperate, the perpetrator, to stop that, to stop her, to stop him, to stop the secret being out there. So he's absolutely right. It's the most dangerous time for a woman. And the other thing I will say, it's a woman who knows when it's best to leave. You may be with a woman or a man who's a victim of domestic abuse and go, well, they're with me now and the perpetrator's not around, and why don't I just take them somewhere? They go somewhere. And if they say no, it's because they know that it's not a good time for them to leave, that things are not in place. Whatever needs to be in place for that person isn't in place. And as Kitty says, they make multiple attempts until everything's in place and they finally are able to leave. So just Baylor and my experiences at Baylor. Baylor Women's Correctional Institute was built to house 200 women and now houses probably 500, over double its capacity, which means that a lot of things that were thought could happen, occur in the facility of 200 can't in the facility of 500 just because of the logistics. So it's a much different environment than it was intended to. It's a very nice facility. It's very up to date. Not one of those images you have of jails of being dungeon-like and that kind of stuff. And it has some programming of its own. It has a safe search certificate program in the kitchen, which promotes kitchen restaurant work when they get out. There's some computer training and some GED training, but that's about all that's done inside, as they say, by hired people who work for the prison. The rest of it's done by volunteer groups like mine who come into the prison. And I work for a group called the Delaware Mentor Program. And we run what's known as a pre-release class for women in the prison. It's a 3-month-long program that operates 5 days a week for 3 months. During that time, we try to offer the women all the resources we can, both for them emotionally inside and outside, to help them make good choices when they get out, help them avoid whatever situation they were in before when they get out, if they, So we start off with a course in journaling, which I teach them, which is how to be able to write about what you're feeling, experiencing it, put it down in words, see it for yourself. The only caution I give them is that I tell them that they can use it to get their emotions out, like when they're hot and they're ready to blow, and they know they can't do that because it'll mean more time for them that to scribble it out in their journal and get rid of it is great. But I caution them to leave it in their journal because they don't know whenever they will have a spot inspection in the prison, which means that they can walk into the room and look at anything in there, and if they picked up the journal and there was. So anyway, we start with that. Sonia Carter, who's one of our Stephen ministers, comes in and does a wonderful program on self-esteem, working with the women to help improve their self-esteem. Because as Kitty alluded to, victims of domestic violence, one of the things their perpetrator does is lower their self-esteem just to the point where they don't have any. So that we work, Weissinger works very hard with them on helping them increase their self-esteem. We do have a person come in and talk about domestic violence because a lot of times they don't see it as domestic violence. It's just life. It's just what they experienced, and nobody's called a spade for them. So we do have people come in and talk about domestic violence with them. We have someone who comes in and teaches them how to handle their money. A lot of resources come in, mental health advocates come in, legal advocates to help them deal with how do you go out and find employment jobs, but anything else with a record, and what can you do to get your record expunged. So we do that. And then I teach a course, get into that the long way, called Setting Appropriate Boundaries. It's based on a book by Charles Whitfield called Boundaries. Wilmington College actually uses it in their counseling program. It's interesting to teach from a text. They're usually texts at the prison because there are reading levels from one end of the spectrum to the other in any group. We have to train so that we have to devise methods to make everyone able to read the book and participate in the discussion. So we have worksheets for each chapter of the book that they get before they read the chapter so that they know what's important in the chapter to pay attention to, and it's helpful to them. There's some people in the group who have, read just fine and read the whole book, and there are other people who read the parts pertain to the worksheet, and there's some women always in the group who can't read. So we go over the worksheet and we talk about the worksheet and we talk so that they too get that information. Boundaries are really, really, really difficult for women, and especially the women in the prison to think about. If we think about it, all of us have boundaries. All of us have boundaries we set with everybody in our lives. And some of them are like brick walls, and some of them are, just a general, but we do, we have boundaries and we reassess them, from time to time, what you feel about and the kind of boundary you need with somebody when you're both this age or that age, or circumstances change. But for them, it's just really, really hard for them to get it. They come in believing that all they have to do is avoid whatever it was that got them in there, and well, yeah, they should avoid that, but that's not going to keep them out of prison. What's going to keep them out of prison is being able to set boundaries. So we start with obvious boundaries. I mean, ones that it's easy for them to say, I won't have anything to do with them. But then we get closer to home and we start talking about friends. They're my friend. I don't care what they do. They're my friend. They won't, how they have to look at their friends. And they're like, no, they're my friends. Why would I need a boundary with my friend? And we go through that, and gradually they begin to see that well, they begin to ask questions: does this friendship support the kind of life I want to have when I get out of here? And if it doesn't, then why am I going to continue with, And so friends are difficult, and throw in boyfriends, girlfriends, and that it becomes even more difficult because, oh my God, he's my boyfriend. He wouldn't, and yet you knew your boyfriend when you were arrested and got sent to jail, and what was his role in it? What did he do to facilitate you coming to jail? And then we get to like husbands and children, and it gets even harder. It gets even harder. And parents, for a lot of them, their parents have been enablers. Their parents have been there, they stepped in, time after time after time again. It's amazing what parents will do when it's a child who's been arrested more than once or in rehab more than once. Lots and lots of parents who have seen their children to rehab for who knows how many times, and every time it's with great hope and great effort. And, the person comes out and they're all rehabbed, and it's, unless they learn to set some appropriate boundaries, they're not going to stay out of rehab that long. So it's very, very hard for them. We take 8 weeks talking about it with them, working with them. Usually by the end of the 8 weeks, they've got it. They've got it. They understand it. There's some hope that they will at least attempt to do this when they get out. Part of the program is that we offer help when they get out to help them hopefully not go back into the situation that they were in when they were arrested, to hopefully give them help them get to a new situation, which will be removed from that and give probably them a better chance of staying out of jail. So we do when they get out, offer them help in getting finding a place to live, getting clothing, finding a job, that kind of stuff. We do an aftercare piece of our program. I can say honestly that our program has a really, really, really good way of keeping women from coming back in prison. There's very few of those who go through our program and get it who do come back to prison. Well, they'll get it the next time, but most of the women get it, and most of the women manage to stay out of jail after they get the idea of setting appropriate boundaries. But it's very, very hard for them to understand. It's very, very hard for them to do. It just, it takes work. It takes awareness. It takes owning what's going on in that relationship. And, it's just hard for them. Think about it. It's the mother who's always, let them stay at the house when they didn't have a place to live, or their mother who always gave them money when they fell short, or their mother who always let them get a free meal there. Well, that mother's not necessarily being helpful doing that. She's being an enabler, that the person knows that anytime they have, they come to a place where they need, some help or need to, rather than, finding something on their own, they just go and they stop at mom's or stay at mom's for a while, or dad's or whatever. So it's just a really hard concept for them, but one that we certainly work very hard on with them. And part of the program is, part of the Don't Mentor program, is that they do participate in the boundaries program for the 8 weeks. That they do turn in the worksheets. We do an easy evaluation at the end, only because of the different reading levels of people, but we do tell them that they will be responsible in some way for knowing the information at the end before they even graduate from boundaries, which is one of the requirements of them completing the course, the pre-release class. So it's interesting. It's challenging to say the least. I think it's worth doing. It's worth doing it with them, because I know that if they get it, they'll stay out. And I've seen the results. I know the results. Part of that's doing due to me now that I'm working with them. I've been doing it a while. And so the prison lets us come in and do this. We have to be approved by the prison to come in and do this because we're outside contractors. I've had my criminal background checked well, because you have to do that before you go in. You have to have a criminal background check. And if you think the church is thorough, wait until you try to jail. And the participants in our class all have to be vetted by the counselors at the prison. They all have to give their approval that this person can attend the class. And it's not a guarantee. It's up to the counselor whether or not they think the person will benefit from a program. So we don't always know who, well, we don't know who's coming, and we sometimes are disappointed that people can't come because of the counselor's decision, but that's up to them. Right now, we don't know when the prison becomes open again, whether or not they'll let outside contractors in to provide services. Right now, no outside contractors are coming in to provide services. None of them, none of the people. The Delaware Center for Horticulture actually has a program there at the prison where they teach them how to grow vegetables and stuff. And other programs come in, but now with COVID, there's just none. So all of us who have done it before, when the prison opens up again, we'll have to apply again for permission to do the work we do there. So we're hopeful that the prison's going to go back and allow us to do the pre-release class, but we just don't have a guarantee of that at the moment. So I would, any questions you have, I'd be happy to answer to the best of my ability. I will say that going to jail is not as scary as I thought it was, but I always tell people that I don't deal with the scary people. They're locked up in maximum security at the other end of the building, and I mean that sincerely, that I don't deal with that level of criminality. These are people who, most of the time, they're first-time offenders. Sometimes they're not. They've been maybe once or twice before, but they're short timers. They're not in there for 25 years. They're sentenced to 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, that kind of thing. So that
Questions
I know you
or
said this.
comments?
How
ahead.
many years have you done this too? I know you said this and I missed it. How many years have you been doing this?
Gosh, since I retired in 2005, so sometime after that. So
Yeah, I mean, I feel like as
probably
long as I've known you,
a
you've been
dozen,
doing this.
maybe. Yeah.
It-
But
At least a dozen, probably more than that.
I think so too.
I really
And is
don't
it all
count.
in person or is some of it virtual?
We do 3. When we do it, it's in person. It's in person. We have a class that we work with for the 3 months, and that's in person. We will do it in person with them. As I say, they're people are short timers. They're not particularly worried about that their behavior is going to be inappropriate in class or that anything might happen. Though there's a guard outside the classroom whenever we work, and he knows who of us are supposed to be there, and he knows who of them are supposed to be there, and he tracks everybody. So it's not just a free-for-all there. We're accounted for.
I think it's really important, the message that has come through, that this situation, this circumstance can happen to anyone there, but
Yeah.
for the grace of God. I know family members, friends, professional women to whom this has happened, and you would think it couldn't.
Yeah.
How could it? Obviously, it's complicated. There's a woman who spoke at Westminster who we helped get her first apartment. She was a college graduate with a son, divorced and owned her own home, developed a relationship with a police officer who gradually took over all of the finances. Told her if she ever left him, he would apply all of his contacts in police departments across the country to track her down and kill her. And finally, he hit her son. So she left with him and went to another state, enrolled her son in school under another name, couldn't get a job because she wouldn't use her social security number. In the meantime, he had stopped paying the mortgage. The house that she owned was repossessed, and he took all of the furnishings and sold them. And she was left with nothing. She could have been me, she could have been you, but for a bad relationship decision, her life was upended. And it happens more often than we know, certainly more often than we acknowledge. And I think the work that's done by people like Kitty and Sue, and the many other volunteers, let alone the counselors who are employed to help, are clearly transformative in deeply meaningful ways.
Right.
So thank you to Kitty, thank
I
you to
would
Sue.
say that I think COVID probably has increased.
The number of cases.
Well, as you say, Sue, this is about keeping a secret, and COVID has helped keeping secrets easier.
Well, COVID has been a problem in that some of the women who have been living with their abuser have had a much harder time during COVID because they weren't able to get out. Maybe the abuser wasn't working. I know that at the center up here in Westchester, they didn't have enough room in the shelter to observe COVID guidelines and handle all of the women. So they had to put some of them in hotels and pay for them because that was the only way they could do it. They've had, at least up here in District County, they've had more calls and more people applying for shelter during COVID than before.
Wow.
So Kitty or Sue, if anybody here this evening, or I've heard from quite a few people who plan to watch the video of tonight, if they have any questions themselves, either about what you've shared, or if anyone has an interest in seeing if there's some possibility for volunteering, perhaps they could get in touch with you. And whether you have the direct information or not, you might be able to provide some guidance or some insight into how to help.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Happy to
Anyone
help.
else? Sue?
Can I ask a question about clearance? Like when you go to Baylor, Sue, or Kitty, when you go to, do you have to have certain security clearances that are unique to what you're doing?
Well, I had to have,
Yeah.
I had to have mostly confidentiality, but because of being a volunteer at the center here in Chester
Right.
County, I had to have all the child abuse clearances, the FBI clearances, the fingerprinting, the whole business in the event that I would encounter anything that could be
Right.
considered as child abuse. But I didn't have to have any police clearance for being at the rehab facility, just confidentiality.
Mhm.
Baylor does require a criminal background check, state, federal, however far it goes. And every one of the volunteers there must have yearly a criminal background check. So having it done once doesn't count. They want to check every year to make sure that you still qualify.
So do you have a badge when you go to the places? Do you have some sort of ID?
I didn't.
And
I think
Um,
Sue's Wi-Fi is a little bit
we
unstable,
don't-
unfortunately.
Well, that's not true. We have a,
They were inmates.
badge that we wear, that identifies us as volunteers, as opposed to a visitor. And so you do get a badge when you go in, and you give it back when you go out. And that's how they know you've left the facility. And I left the facility with my badge on one day and realized that I was gonna be in big trouble, and went back and turned it in because they wouldn't be able to count for me at the end of the day if they didn't have my badge turned in. So I had to go back and give them back my badge.
They'd have to go looking for you, huh?
yeah.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our time here this evening. Thank you again, all of you, for being here. Thank you again to Kitty and Sue, both for the work they've done and for sharing this with us tonight. It's been
Thank you.
very meaningful. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Enjoy the
You all,
weekend.
great to see you.
Happy 4th of July.
Indeed,
Yeah.
happy for it.
You too.
Be safe. Be safe.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Kitty and Sue.